Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Nykirk, the director of the Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement at Northern Kentucky University. Our center is a member of the Northern Kentucky Forum, along with the three public library districts. We're committed to civil civic dialogue in the community, and tonight we are co-hosting with the College of Informatics and Informatics Plus this discussion of cybersecurity and elections, the elections insecurity. We'll be with Dr. James Walden here shortly, but I want to welcome you to tonight's event. It's been a busy week for the forum as we've discussed issues leading up to the elections, and I invite you to go to nkyforum.org for recordings of things earlier this week, including a session with Julie Pace, the Washington editor of the Associated Press, and also a discussion of voter suppression with Tony Chavez, a professor at the College of Law, Chase College of Law at NKU. But tonight we're going to find out why we can't just push a button and vote. It seems so easy, but it's a little more complicated. And let me introduce you first to Kendall Fisher, my colleague at NKU and who is with Informatics Plus. Kendall, good evening.
Good evening. Well, I'm Kendall Fisher. I'm the Executive Director at Informatics Plus, the other half of tonight's partnership at the College of Informatics. And our center is designed to connect informatics students, faculty, and staff to the community and to the world. To that end, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. James Walden is a professor of computer science and director of the Bachelor's of Cybersecurity program at Northern Kentucky University. He has a PhD from Carnegie Mellon University and has over 20 years of experience working in cybersecurity. He started NKU's annual Cybersecurity Symposium in 2007, which brings hundreds of professionals and academics from the tri-state region together to learn about the breadth of cybersecurity, from business and legal issues to highly technical topics. Dr. Walden's open to taking questions throughout his presentation, and there's two methods available to ask questions. You may either type your question into the chat function at any time, and our moderator will collect the questions and share as many of these with Dr. Walden as possible throughout the program. You can also use the raise your hand feature, and our moderator will call on raised hands and unmute your mic so that you can ask the question directly once you're called upon. We'll do our best to address as many questions as time and format will allow. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the Zoom camera over to Dr. James Walden.
Okay, let me share my presentation. I'll start at the beginning. So we're going to talk about security issues with elections, and we're going to look at the whole election process. So we start with pre-election activities like voter registration. We'll look at voting activities, where voters cast their ballots, how votes are tabulated, and how results are submitted. And finally look at how the final results are tallied. And there's multiple systems involved in elections. We're primarily going to look at four of them. We're going to look at registration systems, the actual place where you cast your ballot, the voting machine. We'll look at the tabulation, the vote counting machines, and the poll books. And different voting precincts will have different combinations of those technologies. Some may all four may be electronic, others may have only one of them be electronic. And the US has approximately 5,000 different places where votes are cast with different ballots. Some states do things at the state level uniformly, but others delegate it to counties, and others even delegate it further down to smaller government agencies. An election to be secure should meet these 5 requirements. It should be private, that is, we should have a secret ballot. That's a relatively new innovation, a little over a century old for it being used. It should be incoercible. Voters should not be able to prove how they voted to other people. It should be accurate. The final tally should be the sum of all ballots. It should be available. Voters should be able to vote when they reach the polling place. And note this one requirement alone is enough to eliminate internet voting, because it is incredibly easy to launch denial of service attacks on network services. And those attacks can be purchased for relatively small amounts of money, even by non-technical people. You can pay thousands of dollars per hour to take fairly major websites off the network. And so even if you ignore all the other security issues with internet voting, it just can't meet the availability requirement. Finally, it should be verifiable. That is, the voter can prove to themselves that their ballot was cast as intended. And that's one of the main problems with some voting machines, because humans cannot read memory cards or barcodes or these other types of techniques that some voting machines use to record their votes. Why would someone want to attack an election? Well, they might want a particular candidate or issue to win a race. They may want to just disrupt an election and create doubt about the results. Or third, they might not really care about the election itself, but they may just want to extort money by the threat of disrupting an election. And when looking at security, economic issues are always important. Both attackers and defenders have limited resources. And so attackers will attack the weakest link in election systems. Wherever, of those four types of systems, if one is easier to attack than the others, they're going to attack that one if all other things are the same. Defenders also have limited resources, but unfortunately, we as defenders must secure every system. And this does tell us that we shouldn't overspend on any one area of security. Two, attackers will choose attacks that have the biggest impact for the effort required to carry them out. So an attack that changes one vote isn't very attractive, whereas an attack that can change thousands or hundreds of thousands of votes is very attractive to attackers. And third, they will choose attacks that impose the lowest risk to them. They'll prefer to hack over the internet, hidden behind a chain of proxy servers, probably located in multiple countries with different laws, rather than showing up in person to double vote when they can be arrested and taken to jail that way. So these three principles are going to guide how we're going to evaluate the security of each system. And we'll start with voter registration. Voter registration systems are typically on a network. And while, as the diagram shows, they are probably firewalled from not only the internet, but also other parts of the state government network, firewalls are not that difficult to bypass. The typical way an attacker gets past a firewall is by sending an email. We get these all the time. They're called phishing emails. They come in a couple varieties. The one they would probably use here is that they would email you an attachment. And again, for something like this, it's probably what we call a spear phishing email, where the hacker has researched their target. They know your job, they know your personal life from social media postings, they know what sorts of attachments you are likely to get and open. And they will send you a document of that type, but they'll package it with a security exploit that will install malware on your system. And then that malware will phone home. Will make a connection from the internal network through the firewall back to the attacker. Firewalls very strongly limit what traffic comes in, but are fairly accepting of outgoing traffic because, for example, people inside firewalls want to browse the web or send emails to different people and so forth without vetting every website and email address with the security team to permit that at the firewall. There's a saying in cybersecurity, prevention doesn't work. And it's pretty much true. It just takes a phishing email and they are past your basic prevention techniques. So you need detection systems as well. What do voter registration systems do? Well, they add or remove voters from state voting rolls. Voter registration laws started being passed in the mid-19th century around the time of the Civil War. And part of the reason they were passed was as a voting security measure. So you didn't have to prove who you were when you went to go vote. Instead, you did any complicated proving at the registration stage. Voter registration systems will inevitably accumulate invalid records as people move out of state or between two different voting districts within a state, people who die. And so they do need to be periodically or regularly purged. Unfortunately, voting purges are often used to target people who oppose the party of the person doing the purging, which is usually the state secretary of state. But laws are different in different states. And this is an example purge from Florida in the 2000 election. And the state of Florida contracted with a company and they agreed to match on 80% of the name and a certain percentage of the date of birth. And so these two names, although they're clearly different people, John Fitzgerald George and Johnny Fred Georges, and they were born on different days, although only a couple days away from each other. But because those both match the same criteria, if one of those people moved or was otherwise disqualified for voting, both of people would be purged by that process. And the estimate is that the state of Florida incorrectly purged tens of thousands of voters this way from their registration systems. And so when you think about how the official vote count was hundreds of votes different, but tens of thousands were removed from the voting rolls without being able to vote successfully. You see, this is a much larger effect than the difference between the two parties in the election. So voter registration systems offer a lot of leverage to attackers. The voting purges are typically in the tens of thousands of people. And so an attack could plausibly remove many thousands of voters. We also know that these are systems that have been attacked. Now, if you are removed from registration, you may be able to use a provisional ballot, but polling places aren't very competent at handling exceptional procedures, as is any job. Something you do fairly rarely, you're not as good at. And that means it takes more time. Also, there's a limited number of provisional ballots. And if vote counting takes a large amount of time, they may not get around to ever counting provisional ballots. So provisional ballots are a nice feature to mitigating against registration attacks, but not an adequate feature. And we know in the 2018 election that multiple states were attacked by Russian hackers. They did get voting data information. We don't know if they altered any voting rolls, and unfortunately, a lot of systems just don't have enough monitoring to detect that, whether that happened or not. But presumably it wasn't tremendously huge, as we didn't see news reports about a lot of complaints about people who were mysteriously purged. But note those news reports would happen well after the election. So if they had, the election outcome could be changed before it was detected and reported. Next, we have the poll books, which historically are 3-ring binders, but today is more often a laptop and a barcode reader and a keyboard and a mouse, as you see here. The poll books contain the voters for each precinct, and this data is copied from the voter registration database. So any attack that works on the registration database will be propagated out to the poll books. Electronic poll books can be faster, but in actual elections, we've had reliability issues where software hasn't worked or crashed or has been very slow. Poll books do need to be networked to each other so that when you cross off somebody's name indicating they voted, every one of the poll books for the precinct records that. But they should absolutely not be on the internet because that would subject them to attacks from hackers from across the world. From the attacker perspective, these aren't very attractive targets. The impact of poll book, an individual precinct, typically has hundreds of voters, so it's not huge, especially compared to the whole registration database, and it's fairly expensive. If they're not connected to the internet, you're going to have to attack them in person. You might be able to, if they're like wirelessly networked to each other, you might be able to do that from a mile away with a good antenna still. So you might not have to be in the polling place itself. But still high risk compared to registrations, but low risk compared to actual voting. And here I have a cartoon from the popular technical comic XKCD. And as it says, when you ask a lot of engineers, they tell you about how safe things like elevators and bridges and airplanes are. But the moment you start asking computer scientists and software engineers about computerized voting, they tell you it's a horrible idea, that you should not trust voting software and don't listen to anyone who tells you otherwise. And unfortunately, that is pretty much the case of how security is. That said, voting fraud is extremely rare. The penalties for voting fraud are severe. It is a felony. Audits have been performed by both partisan and independent groups. And really the most they could find was single digits over multiple years in fairly large jurisdictions containing, 100,000 plus people. Where they did find it happening was in local races, because in-person voting fraud, like, okay, you voted twice, that's one vote. That's not going to change a federal election or probably a state election, but it might change something like a city council or school district race in a small town. There's much better targets. Even the poll books are better targets, and certainly registration is a much better target for the attacker. Why are we using voting machines? And that goes back to the 2000 election in Florida, where you see those two photos, one showing a paper jam in a voting machine and the other showing the famous hanging chads. Because of the paper jam, the hole punch doesn't completely punch the hole out of the paper. And that led to the question of, how do you count those votes? Do you only count a vote where the hole is clear through? Do you count hanging chads? Do you count pregnant chads where there's an impression but there's no cut anywhere around the chad? So it left a lot of debate as to how the vote should be counted. And so Congress passed the Help America Vote Act, which provided one-time funding for voting machines, but had no security requirements. So a variety of companies rushed out to produce voting software, which unfortunately turned out to be very low quality and very low security. And we've been living with those machines ever since. A voting machine is really just a PC. It's a Windows PC. It's put in a case that looks a little different, and it usually has a touch screen. But really internally, it's just like any other Windows PC. And every month, Windows sends you security updates. This month, last Tuesday, Windows sent a total of 87 fixes, 11 of which were ranked as critical vulnerabilities to fix. Voting machines, on the other hand, unlike most PCs, are stored in a warehouse powered off most of the year. That means they're not getting these security updates regularly. Some jurisdictions do apply security updates before they deploy the voting machines. But no, you do have to be careful about that because the normal way of getting the updates is over the internet. You don't want to expose a machine that doesn't have updates to the internet. And unfortunately, in most states, voting machines have to be recertified when you update the software. And so voting machine vendors don't like to have to go through that process. And that process means there's basically no way that you can get the October fixes for a November election. Like Windows PCs, network worms exist that can spread from machine to machine. Typically, voting machines are not networked, but again, this is a reason why they should never be connected to the internet and why internet voting will never work. But voting machines do have to be configured with the ballot for each election. And so that means that someone, usually a contractor, a private company working for the state government, will be employed to configure the ballot on each machine. And the way that's done is that there's election management software on a regular PC, and the people running the election create the configuration, and that configuration is stored on some type of memory card. It could be like the memory card cameras use or a USB drive. And some of them use some really old technologies because they're back from around 2003 when the Help America Vote Act was passed. But whatever technique they have, that media that the ballot configuration is stored on can also contain malware, malicious software designed to infect the voting machine. So even though the machines are not on a network, malware can spread through the ballot configuration process. And yes, there are real world malware types that spread this way. In fact, a popular technique for penetration testing firms, which are security firms that get hired to test the security of an organization, one thing they often do is drop USB drives in the company's parking lot, waiting for some person in the company to pick one up and plug it into their PC. Note their PC is inside the firewall. They've bypassed the firewall by picking up the drive and plugging it into their PC. When they do that, the software on the USB drive phones home to the testers, and they know that they've gotten past the firewall. And now that software will let them launch attacks from inside the firewall to see what else is hackable in the company. So spreading malicious software via these means is really common. It's a well-known technique. There's free tools for doing it. So this is a very real threat. And note, some of these private companies work for many different voting jurisdictions. So potentially malware from one state in Kansas, say, could get on a voting machine in Kentucky through this process. And so while individual voting machines are a fairly poor target because they only record typically hundreds of votes per voting machine, if you can attack many voting machines, especially through a private company that could reach them in many different states, that's a more attractive target. Also, fraud can be invisible. Most malicious software doesn't pop up a window saying, hey, you've been infected. There's pretty much only one type of malware that does that, and that is ransomware, which we'll talk about later. Most malicious software is completely invisible. In fact, given the number of people at this talk, probably more than one of you has a PC that's actually under the control of some criminal organization invisibly. And then you might think you might be able to create a different type of PC to make fraud visible. And unfortunately, it can actually be mathematically proven that there is no perfect detection system for malicious software. There is antivirus, but antivirus will just find things it's seen before. If you've created a new piece of malware, the antivirus will not detect that. And even if your voting software is perfect, it's running on Microsoft Windows, which has all these security vulnerabilities and exposes you to attacks that way. So what vulnerabilities have we actually seen? There used to be some legal issues around examining voting software, and security researchers got the US government to pass an exemption for researching voting machines, I think like 2015 or 16. And so the premier hacking conference, DEF CON, started what they call a voting village, where they invite people to come and try to hack the dozens to hundreds of voting machines that they purchased for this purpose. And the voting village is attended by security researchers, but also by a lot of government officials, especially election officials. Every year they did this, every device was hacked. They never found a voting machine they could not penetrate in some way. The easiest way they got in were default passwords, that the machine shipped with a password and you just looked in the manual and you used that password. And some of the passwords were literally the word password. So you didn't even need the manual, you could just guess. They had a lot of old bugs. They had not fixed vulnerabilities. So some of the bugs that were used were over 10 years old. They were usually able to access the operating system. So the voting machine normally should only let you access it through the touch screen. But some of them have open USB ports. Others had insecure panels hiding USB ports or memory card ports, so you could plug those in and attack it, like the malware I talked about earlier. Some of them were keyed. One of the most popular keys was the standard hotel minibar key. So it was really easy to get into these systems each year. So voting machines are not only potentially hackable, they are definitely hackable in real world environments. And that's one disadvantage of secret voting, is that you're there in the voting booth and no one can see you stick a USB device into the voting machine and use that to hack it. And there are these popular USB devices called rubber duckies that are designed for just that purpose. You plug it in, it types in a lot of hacking attempts at machine speeds. Basically, the computer thinks it's a keyboard, but it's this more complicated device that has its own storage and so forth, and types at these inhuman speeds, launching, hundreds of attacks in a few seconds. Our biggest defense for voting machines is that American voting systems are incredibly diverse. As you can see from this map, some states use the same system everywhere. You'll notice Kentucky and Ohio and Indiana, the tri-state, none of those are in that boat. And this means that the attacker has to figure out how to hack each type differently. So the way you get into one voting machine is going to be very different from the way you hack a different voting machine. And that also means your malware is not going to work on other types of voting machines. It's only going to work on the one you designed it for. You could design it for multiple voting machines, but that's a lot more effort. And so overall, that's why attacks on voting machines aren't one of my big worries about our elections. They're definitely hackable, but each voting machine typically records hundreds of votes only, so it's not nearly as an attractive target. You tend to have to get to them in person in some way, and they're in many different types, and so that means you need to write a lot of different types of attacks to make these attacks work. That said, there is one bad trend towards what are called ballot marking devices. They were designed as accessible options for disabled people. They can read the ballots out for blind people. They're easy to switch between languages. they were really uncommon until this election, when about 20% of them, of people are supposed to use them this year. And some of them are fine because they record a humanly readable ballot. But a lot of them, the most popular ones in particular, record barcodes, which are not humanly readable. And there have been issues with them. They're quite a bit slower than using paper ballots, and there have been some reliability issues. There was one case where the barcode would only include votes for 2 out of 3 candidates for one race. So the one person, people voted for him, but no ballot was ever recorded as that happening. So these have disadvantages. What do we need to do to secure the voting process? And what we need are risk limiting audits. And to do an audit, this means you need to have some form of paper ballot. There are voting machines still in use where they only record the vote on a memory card. And some of those don't even record individual ballots, they just record totals. So when you ask these voting machines to do a recount, it just says, you know, the voting machine has a total of 126 votes for candidate A, and it'll just tell you that. It just reads the number off the memory card again. So it's not an actual recount. Once we have voter readable ballots, that means we can do audits. Now, doing a recount of all the votes is typically prohibitively time consuming and costly. But a risk limiting audit is a rigorous statistical procedure that tells you if the race is, you know, this close, say 2%, and you want to know with 99% accuracy who won, you need to take a random sample of this many ballots and count those. And that will tell you if you're accurate to within that case. If you fall into that 1%, so you're not 99% sure, the procedure tells you, okay, you're in that unsure range, you need to take another larger random sample and recount that until you are certain. This is a freely published procedure. A few states already require it, and some other states, including Ohio, have done it optionally. The nice thing about risk limiting audits is that they don't only protect us against voting machines, they really protect us against all forms of voting fraud. This will also detect problems with mail-in ballots just the same way it does with voting machines. And while it would be really good to have vendors produce more secure machines, really, as long as we have the risk limiting audits, we can detect and handle problems with elections. So in summary, voting machines are vulnerable to hacking. But the high diversity increases the cost of attack. Widespread voting by mail this year reduces the use of hackable voting machines. And printing voter readable ballots and using risk limiting audits can tremendously mitigate security vulnerabilities in both voting by mail and voting by machine. Our biggest issue with voting machines has been really reliability. That unfortunately PCs aren't really meant to be stored in a warehouse and used once or twice a year. They like being powered on 24/7. That's their most reliable working conditions. And in a nice climate controlled data center, which is not a warehouse. And so it's not surprising they've had a lot of hardware issues. They've also had a lot of software issues. They're not as bad as they were back around 2000, where one precinct in Florida gave Al Gore minus 16,022 votes. The good thing about that was that you immediately knew something was wrong. You can't get a negative number of votes. What actually happened is what, perhaps if you've looked at gaming, especially historically, a lot of games, you could overflow the counters and weird things would happen. Computer numbers work like numbers on a clock. So, a clock, after 12 o'clock, the numbers reset and go back to 1. Or in the case of sine numbers, they go back to the lowest negative number, -12, which is where you got that -16,000 votes. And knowing that problem, you can go and calculate what that number really was as a positive number. We haven't seen issues that bad with them, but we have seen a lot of issues still with software reliability as well.
James, before you move on, we have a question from Linda, and she asked, are there any specific hacks that have been uncovered or identified for this year's election?
There have not been any published hacks for this year's election, no. As we'll see in some of our later steps, there have been some mistakes, especially with printing and shipping ballots by mail, but we have not seen any known hacks this year like we did in 2018 so far. So tabulation, that comic is Boss Tweed, and what he's saying is basically, as long as I count the votes, what are you going to do about it? After all, yeah, if you can subvert the total count, it doesn't really matter if everything else before that was done correctly. And this is one disadvantage of humanly marked ballots, is that they do sometimes lead to questions. And these are from the 2008 Minnesota election, which I picked mainly because they printed a lot of samples of ballots like this. And so we see here, we've got a Senate race. The person has clearly filled out the oval for the Republican candidate, but another race has bled over from the other side of the page or from another page of the ballot. And so the question is, yeah, who do you count this Senate race for? It is usually a regulation when counting ballots is that distinguishing marks will disqualify a ballot from being counted because it violates the principle of incoercibility. That is, if you could make distinguishing marks, you could go tell someone, hey, I voted the way that you told me, pay me, or vice versa. If someone threatens you, like you'll lose your job. If you don't vote your employer's way, you can show your ballot and say, here, I did vote the way you said. So distinguishing marks, is that someone trying to do that, or are they just being weird about how they're marking it? And depending on how strictly you evaluate these, it's like, well, your oval wasn't perfectly filled out. Does that count as a distinguishing mark? And so different political campaigns can challenge ballots and how they're counted. So it's always potentially an issue there. And this last one, the person has put these big X's through certain races, presumably because they didn't mean to, they didn't want to vote for anyone there, but that could be a distinguishing mark. So this is one of the issues with mail-in ballots too, since they could contain confusing marks like this or distinguishing marks. One idea is that hopefully when a machine prints a ballot, you don't have problems like this. On the other hand, I'm sure all of us have run into printer problems over the years where the printer produces streaks or it fades out. And so voting printed paper ballots have some problems too. They're not perfect. What about the tabulation software? So tabulators are PCs too, just like voting machines and voting registration systems. But they have additional risks. Like registration systems, they may be accessible via network or fax. And attacks on these have a much higher impact than attacks on individual voting machines, since you can affect a larger number of votes. And attacks can create doubt about the results. There was a denial of service attack against Knox County, Tennessee in 2018. And it didn't change the tallies, but it did prevent the tallies from being viewed on their website. And so it did create some doubt about what was happening there. Note that risk limiting audits do protect against tabulation attacks, as well as attacks against voting machines and mail-in ballots. So what are our most likely risks? This is a list from the Caltech MIT voting project, their presentation for 2020. The presenter was a political scientist, so I do have some additional risks as a computer scientist. But I do find his numbers interesting. So first, errors in voter registration data affects 3 to 5% of voters. I actually got removed from the voting rolls myself in 2019, so I checked very carefully in 2020 to be sure that I was on the rolls before the registration deadline ended. And I recommend that everyone do that. Vote by mail mistakes. Maybe about 1% may not get delivered in both directions. So you lose 1% going to the voter and 1% going back. And 1 to 2% may be rejected because they haven't filled out the ballot correctly, as we saw examples of, or we have the inner envelope and the outer envelope, and you need 2 signatures, at least in Kentucky. And so being sure all that's right is worth doing if you're voting by mail, and you don't want to be of those 1 to 2% whose votes get rejected. Long lines have unfortunately become a tradition in American elections, and potentially interference for in-person voters. There was a consent decree that prevented a lot of voter intimidation tactics that expired last year. And so we might see more of those this year. And finally, we may see and are likely to see delays in ballot tabulation due to a higher number of votes and a higher number of mail-in votes. And that's not really a risk that results in the election results being wrong, but a lot of Americans are accustomed to seeing the votes, that the night of election day, which is a relatively modern thing that didn't happen throughout most of the nation's history. So it's not really a problem if we don't have a tally for a week or two after the election. After all, that's why the Constitution allows for quite a bit of period between Election Day and the time the Electoral College casts votes, and the time between when the President and the new Congress take office. So these delays aren't a problem, but they can seem to be a problem for people who are impatient. So what problems actually have we seen in these areas? And we saw Summit County. We saw ballots were delayed a week because the ballot printing company screwed up. We also saw a ballot company in Ohio printing ballots incorrectly and sending those to voters. And the one that seems most malicious, though, is that a postal employee in Louisville threw away 112 mail-in ballots before they could be shipped to voters. So that wouldn't necessarily prevent someone from voting. They could still show up and vote in person or request another ballot and get it in time, but maybe they wouldn't notice in time to get another mail-in ballot, and they might not be able to reach the polls. So we haven't seen a lot of problems yet. These are the only 3 news stories I was able to find. The 2 mistaken ones have a much larger impact potentially than the one malicious attack. Which also points out again, one person is usually not a problem in an election. Okay, what about what I worry about as a computer scientist? One thing is ransomware. Ransomware is endemic. I see local governments every week get infected by ransomware. And what it does is it encrypts your data and demands payment in a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin to get your data back. And for one-day event, okay, admittedly there's early voting and mail-in ballots, but primarily election day is a one-day event. There would be tremendous pressure to pay, even if the demands were, completely exorbitant in the millions of dollars. Of course, a lot of jurisdictions might not be able to come up with that much in Bitcoin in time to pay by the end of election day. Also, there's fake ransomware, the biggest of which was NotPetya just a couple years ago. It targeted companies operating in the Ukraine. One shipping company, it's a global shipping company, they had one copy of the Ukrainian tax software that NotPetya targeted. It bricked every machine in their company. They had to replace everything. And the only reason the company didn't go out of business is that there was one server in Africa that had all the user accounts and so forth, and the master records was an Active Directory server for the technical people out there. And it was off the network, powered off because there had been a problem with it earlier. So they had to get that one server back to the main corporate office in Sweden and try to restore the whole company. They filed a cyber insurance claim for over $100 million for just that one company, and this affected a lot of companies. Currently, their insurer is denying the claim, arguing that this was a Russian cyber attack and they do not pay for acts of war, which they claim this was. But fake ransomware could eliminate every election system of a particular type. Again, it does have to target a particular type of system. Unfortunately, we do have variety between the different states and the different districts within states. So again, diversity is our real strength. And it's getting late. I'm going to skip the details on that and talk a little bit about the Electoral College. This is the Electoral College map from the 2016 election. And what I want to draw your attention to is, hey, Spotted Eagle got a vote. So did Kasich. So did Sanders. And wait a minute, they weren't the two major parties' candidates. Those are produced by so-called faithless electors. 29 states have laws making it a felony for an elector to vote against how they're told to vote by their state government, which is traditionally by the popular vote for that state for president. But some electors can defect, and there has been pressure this year to cause electors to defect. And that is one potential worry. And why has the Electoral College been such a big issue recently? And, when I went to school, they talked about, oh yeah, the popular vote winner lost back in the 1800s, but now it's happening within our lifetimes. And the reason that is happening is not because there weren't any close elections between 1888 and 2000, but rather because the Electoral College size has historically small compared to the population. The Electoral College size has not changed since the 23rd Amendment in 1961, and the population of the US has almost doubled. How can we make it bigger? And sort of avoid this happening? We could expand the House of Representatives. The House size is determined by a law from 1929. It's not set by the Constitution. And historically, it grew with the US population. But today, the size of the average House district is over 10 times the size as it was in the early days of the country. And if you ever wonder why you can't actually get anything but a form letter from your representative, well, they're representing a lot more people than they used to. And so they have a lot less time for all of us. Congress is actually fairly small by modern countries' legislatures. Like The United Kingdom, Germany, most countries are larger than the US, except Japan. It's not. Let me skip that because I don't want to go into details, but I do want to mention the 1876 election. In 1876, there were disputes about the electoral vote count. The popular vote winner was clear, but there were 20 electoral votes from 4 states where they had 2 different sets of electors. And the Constitution and our laws are not clear on how that should be resolved. The Republicans argued the vice president should decide, and the Democrats argued that the Congress as a whole decides, and it's really not clear. There was a compromise. The Democrats, especially the Southern ones, really wanted to end Reconstruction, and the Republicans really wanted Hayes to be president, and so they made a trade and resolved the constitutional crisis with the Compromise of 1877. There has been a fair bit of talk this year about state legislatures sending a different set of electors from who the popular vote indicates in certain states like Pennsylvania and Florida. We could end up with this sort of constitutional crisis again. And the question this year is, do we have something where we could reach a compromise like they did in 1877? Hopefully this doesn't happen, but it is a possibility. So what do we need to do to secure voting? We really need to provide adequate resources so everyone can vote in a reasonable amount of time. We need humanly readable paper ballots, no matter how you vote, no matter what type of machine you use. And we need risk-limiting audits to detect any problems. The House of Representatives actually has passed a law, a bill that is, providing for those. The Senate has not considered that bill, though. So we don't currently have those protections, but we could get them by an act of Congress. And so that brings me to an end to my presentation, and I can take questions now.
It looks like we have a question in the chat from Jen. She says, is there software that can analyze signatures to match the voter record? Is it a possibility for the future?
Yeah, there is software that does handwriting recognition. And so we could automate that part of the check-in process when it checks your signature when you go in to vote against the poll book.
Okay, and Dr. Kirby says, are there any other democracies outside the US whose voting systems are especially secure?
Most other countries, unfortunately, for us, have much simpler election systems. Like I said, there's 5,000 different voting districts with different ballots. And so we've got a uniquely difficult problem to solve just because we vote for so many different things, you know, from your city council, county offices, state offices, federal offices. So most other countries have a much simpler problem. And, but that said, none of them have particularly turned out to be free of security problems in their electronic systems. There's really no great exemplar out there.
Just a reminder, you can post your questions in the chat, and we have enabled you to unmute yourself. So if you have a question you'd like to ask vocally, you can do that as well. Dr. Walden, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think this covers everything. You know, we do have, you know, there are serious security issues around electronic systems, but there are some good ways to do it. And really that is the humanly readable paper ballot and risk limiting audits. That's really the prescription that will solve a lot of our problems, as well as offering adequate resources. One of the big problems with the Help America Vote Act is that jurisdictions bought voting machines, but that's a one-time injection of money. What do they do, now 17 years later when those machines are wearing out?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Walden, for sharing this with us tonight. This program was recorded, so we will archive this, and that may be available upon request if you'd like that. There is an event coming up on Monday evening, and that will be with journalism professor Michelle Day, and they will be talking about the journalism program, and it's a discussion on becoming a journalist innovator. So if you'd like to follow along with what the College of Informatics is doing at NKU, definitely join that. And if you would like more information about the Northern Kentucky Forum or Informatics Plus, we are going to throw the links to those programs up in the chat as well. So thank you for joining us this evening and have a great night.